The air in the great hall of Ashen Vale reeked of dominance and old wine. 300 bodies pressed against the stone walls, their collective heat turning the winter night into something fevered and dangerous. Torchlight crawled across the vaulted ceiling in writhing shadows, and the massive oak table at the center groaned under the weight of roasted venison, honey-laced pheasant, and towers of winter fruit. This was the full moon gathering, the night when the pack came together to celebrate their strength, their unity, their place in the world. Weslyn Ashgrove moved through the crowd like a ghost. Her feet were silent on the polished floor. Her eyes were fixed on the ground. She carried a silver tray laden with crystal goblets filled with blood-red wine, and she did not spill a single drop. She never did. In the kingdom of Ashen Vale, scent was everything. It was your rank, your soul, your destiny carved into the marrow of your bones. The high alphas smelled of cedar and smoke and power. The omegas carried the sweetness of vanilla and spring rain. Even the betas had their place, their scent a steady hum of earth and iron. But Weslyn had nothing, no scent, no rank, no existence. A null. She was 23 years old and invisible. She refilled goblets, cleared plates, moved between bodies with practiced precision. Her hands were steady. Her face was a careful blank. She had learned long ago to make herself small, to fold inward until she was nothing more than a shadow in a room full of fire. At the head table sat the nobles. Lord Haldrick, the High Counselor, his silver hair swept back from a face carved from granite. He was 55 years old, a warrior who had fought in the Great War and returned with scars that mapped his arms and chest. Beside him, Lady Rowena, a vision in crimson silk, her blonde hair cascading over bare shoulders. She was a high alpha from the northern wastes, brought here to forge an alliance through marriage. Her scent was intoxicating, a blend of wild roses and frozen pine that made every alpha in the room turn their heads. And at the center, the empty throne, carved from black obsidian, its high back etched with the sigils of the Thornwall bloodline. Empty because the Alpha King did not attend gatherings anymore. He had not attended anything in months. Weslyn moved toward the high table, tray balanced on one hand. Lady Rowena's goblet was empty, the ruby wine staining the bottom like old blood. Weslyn reached forward, careful not to meet anyone's eyes, and began to pour. A hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Weslyn froze. "Clumsy creature." The voice was sharp, cold, dripping with contempt. Matron Griselda loomed over her, the head of household staff, a woman built like a mountain and twice as unyielding. Her graying hair was pulled into a severe knot, and her eyes were the color of stone. "You spilled wine on Lady Rowena's gown." Weslyn's breath caught. She looked down. The tray had tilted slightly in her other hand, a single drop rolling down the side of the decanter, but Lady Rowena's gown was pristine, unmarked. "I did not." "Are you calling me a liar?" Griselda's grip tightened, her nails digging into Weslyn's skin. The hall went silent. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward them. Weslyn felt the weight of their stares like a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders, stealing the air from her lungs. Lady Rowena leaned back in her chair with a slow smile. "It is fine, matron." The girl meant no harm. But Griselda did not let go. "She is a defect, a stain on this household, and tonight, under the blood moon, we cannot afford mistakes." The blood moon. Weslyn had almost forgotten. Once a year, when the moon turned crimson and full, the alphas grew restless, their wolves prowling just beneath the skin. It was a night of ritual, of ceremony, of blood and sacrifice. Lord Haldrick rose from his seat, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. His voice was deep, resonant, the kind of voice that commanded armies. Matron Griselda is correct. We cannot afford distractions tonight. His eyes, pale gray and cold, fixed on Westlin. The null has proven herself unfit for service in the Great Hall. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Unfit. The word hung like a death sentence. She should be exiled, someone shouted from the back. Send her into the blizzard. No, Lord Haldrick said, and the hall fell silent again. Exile is too kind. Tonight is the blood moon. The Alpha King requires attendance. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Attendance. Everyone knew what that meant. The king's chambers were forbidden during the blood moon. The feral madness took him, turned him into something monstrous, something that could not be controlled. Those who entered did not return. Griselda's smile widened. On your knees, girl. Westlin's legs gave out. She sank to the stone floor, the tray clattering beside her, wine spilling across the polished surface like a pool of blood. The crowd leaned in, their eyes gleaming. Broken, someone whispered. Useless trash. Lord Haldrick stepped down and stopped in front of her kneeling form. Westlin Ashgrove, you are hereby sentenced to serve the Alpha King's chambers this night. Should you survive until dawn, you may return to your duties. Should you not... He paused. May the moon have mercy. Westlin kept her eyes on the floor, her hands curled into fists. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. Griselda yanked her to her feet. Go. Now. She stumbled toward the side door, the crowd parting like a sea, their laughter following her into the cold stone corridor beyond. The hallway was dark and empty. Westlin leaned against the wall, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Her wrist throbbed where Griselda had grabbed her, red marks already blooming on her pale skin. The king's chambers during the blood moon. She was going to die. Her fingers fumbled at the hidden pocket inside her apron, and she felt the cool, smooth glass beneath her fingertips. The suppressant. Her lifeline. The only thing standing between her and discovery. She held the vial up to the torchlight. The liquid inside was pale green, flecked with bits of dried herbs. Bitter chamomile, crushed lavender, and the rarest ingredient of all, silver bark root, harvested under a new moon. It was the recipe her mother had taught her, whispered in the dark when Westlin was just a child. Her mother. The memory hit her like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, standing in the shadows of the execution square. 15 years ago. The sky was gray, choked with smoke. At the center, bound to a wooden stake, was her mother. Marin Ashgrove was beautiful even then. Her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and her eyes, the same deep amber as Westlin's, were calm. She did not scream. She did not beg. Lord Haldrick stood at the front of the crowd, a scroll in his hands. He was younger then, his hair still dark, but his face was just as hard. Marin Ashgrove, you stand accused of blood sorcery, of using forbidden arts to manipulate the natural order. The sentence is death by fire. Marin's gaze swept the crowd and found Westlin hiding in the shadows. Their eyes met. Her mother's lips moved, forming words only Westlin could see. Hide, be strong, survive. And then the flames rose. The memory faded. Westlin opened her eyes, the vial clutched tight in her fist. Her mother had died because she was different, because the council feared what they did not understand. Westlin had spent 15 years hiding, suppressing her true nature, pretending to be nothing. But tonight, there was no more hiding. She pushed herself off the wall and began the long walk toward the king's wing. She climbed the spiral staircase, her footsteps echoing. At the top, iron-bound doors loomed before her, black and imposing. 2 guards stood on either side, their faces pale, their hands gripping spears with white-knuckled intensity. "You are the null," one said. It was not a question. Westlin nodded. "Poor girl, may the moon be kind." They pulled the doors open, and heat rolled out like a physical wave, thick and oppressive. Westlin stepped inside. The doors slammed shut behind her. The king's chambers were a nightmare made real. The air reeked of ozone and old blood, a smell so thick it coated the back of her throat. The fire in the hearth roared, flames leaping high, but the heat did nothing to dispel the chill that crept down her spine. The room was massive, with vaulted ceilings and walls lined with weapons, swords, axes, shields, all stained with rust or blood or both. And at the center, hunched over a massive mahogany desk, was the Alpha King, Draven Thornwall. Westlin had never seen him up close. She had only glimpsed him from afar, a towering figure in black, his face shadowed by the hood of his cloak. But now, in the flickering firelight, she saw him clearly. He was a monster. His shirt was discarded, revealing a back mapped with silver scars that crisscrossed his skin like a spider's web. Some old and faded, others still pink and raw. His muscles were corded, bunching and flexing as he gripped the edges of the desk so hard the wood began to splinter. But it was the veins that made her blood run cold. Black veins, thick and pulsing, crawled up his neck like the roots of some poisonous plant. They spread across his shoulders, down his arms, and when he turned his head slightly, she saw them reaching toward his jaw. Shadow poison. She had heard the stories. A cursed blade from the Great War 10 years ago, when Ashenvale fought the Eastern Kingdoms. The blade had pierced Draven's chest, and though the wound had healed, the poison remained, festering, feeding on his alpha rage. He was dying, slowly, painfully. A low growl rumbled from his chest, vibrating through the floor. Westlin's hand instinctively reached for the vial in her apron. "Leave." The word was barely human. Gravel and pain and the sound of something breaking. Westlin swallowed. "I have your evening tray, Your Majesty." Another growl, deeper. "I said leave, now, or I will tear you apart." She should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but her feet would not move. She stood rooted, her eyes fixed on the black veins spreading across his skin. The mark over his heart pulsed with sickly purple light, throbbing in time with his heartbeat. She could see it from where she stood. Westlin took a step forward. "Your Majesty, the poison, it is spreading." Draven's head snapped up. His eyes were no longer human. They were molten gold, burning with feral intensity, pupils slit like a wolf's. They locked onto her with predatory focus. "What did you say?" Her courage faltered, but she forced herself to speak. "The mark over your heart. It is worse than before." He stared at her for a long moment, chest heaving, hands still gripping the desk. Then slowly, he straightened. He was massive, easily 6'4", his frame broad and powerful despite the poison eating him alive. "How would you know?" "I have studied healing. My mother was a healer." A bitter laugh. "A healer. And what makes you think you can help me, girl? Dozens have tried. All of them failed." "I do not know if I can," Westlin admitted, "but I can try." Something flickered in his eyes, something almost human. Then the feral rage surged back and he snarled, teeth bared, "Get out!" Westland took another step forward. She reached into her apron and pulled out the suppressant vial, holding it up to the firelight. The pale green liquid shimmered. Draven's eyes narrowed. "What is that? A sedative?" "It might help with the pain," she lied. He laughed again, harsh and broken. "Nothing helps with the pain." But his gaze lingered on the vial. She moved closer, step by careful step, until she stood just a few feet away. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the raw power coiled beneath the surface. She set the tray on the edge of the desk. Her hand was shaking. The vial slipped from her fingers. Time slowed. The glass tumbled through the air, glinting in the firelight. Westland reached for it, but her hand closed on empty air. The vial struck the stone hearth with a sharp crack and shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. The bitter smell of herbs evaporated instantly, rising like smoke. And then something else bloomed. It started as a whisper, a faint thread of scent that curled through the air. Wild winter jasmine, sweet and sharp, mixed with the rich warmth of ancient honey. Delicate and powerful, all at once. A scent that did not belong in this world of stone and blood. Westland gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. No. No, no, no. The suppressant, the only thing keeping her scent hidden, gone, shattered on the floor. And now he could smell her. Draven moved. One moment he was across the room. The next he was there, looming over her, his massive frame blocking out the firelight. Westland stumbled back, but he was faster. His hand shot out and slammed against the door behind her head, the impact rattling her teeth. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, and inhaled. It was a long, shuddering breath, as if he were pulling the very soul out of her body. His eyes fluttered closed, and for the first time since she had entered the room, the tension in his shoulders eased. "What are you?" he whispered. Westland's breath came in short, shallow gasps. Her body betrayed her before her mind could resist. Her skin flushed hot. Her knees weakened. Something deep in her core pulled toward him like iron to a magnet, and she hated it. She did not want this. She had spent 15 years making sure this would never happen. "I am nothing," she managed. "I am a null. Please, Your Majesty, let me go." His eyes opened. They were no longer feral. They were human, clear, filled with something that looked like wonder. "You lie." His other hand came up, fingers brushing against her throat, not squeezing, just resting there. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. His skin was rough, calloused from years of holding a sword, but his touch was almost gentle. And the moment their skin met, a spark erupted. Golden light flared between them, bright and blinding. Westland cried out. Draven jerked back, staring at his hand as if it had betrayed him. The light faded, but the feeling remained. A warmth spreading through Westland's chest, sinking into her bones, wrapping around her heart like invisible chains. The mate bond, snapping into place like a lock clicking shut. "No," she breathed. "No, this cannot be. Mine." The word was a growl, possessive and absolute. Draven stepped forward again, his hand cupping the back of her neck, fingers tangling in her hair. "You are mine. My wolf knows, even if you do not." Westland shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "I am not. I cannot be." But even as she spoke, she felt it, the bond tightening, her body leaning into him when her mind screamed to pull away. Her skin burning where he touched, not with pain, but with something far more terrifying. Want. She wanted him, and she hated herself for it. Draven's mouth descended toward hers, and Westland's world tilted on its axis. The kiss did not come. A sharp knock echoed through the chamber. Draven froze, his lips a breath away from hers, and snarled. "What?" The door creaked open, and Lord Haldrick stepped inside, flanked by 4 council members. Their faces paled as they took in the scene. The Alpha King, half-dressed and feral, holding a null maid against the door. "Your Majesty," Haldrick said, his voice carefully neutral. "We heard reports. We came to ensure your safety." Draven did not move. His hand remained on Westland's neck, his body shielding hers. "I am fine." "With respect, Your Majesty, you do not appear fine." Haldrick's gaze flickered to Westland. "What is she doing here?" "She brought my evening tray, and stayed." "Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. The girl is a null. She has no business in your private chambers." Draven's grip on Westland tightened. "She stays." Westland could feel the tension, thick and suffocating. She forced herself to speak, her voice small but steady. "I administered a sedative, my lords. His Majesty collapsed. I was ensuring he did not harm himself." The lie came easily, smoothly. Haldrick's eyes narrowed. "A sedative? And where did you acquire such a thing?" "My mother was a healer. She taught me." Haldrick's expression darkened. "Your mother, Murren Ashgrove." The name hung in the air like a curse. The woman executed for blood sorcery. "She was a healer," Westland said, her voice breaking. "Not a sorceress." Haldrick stepped closer, his eyes cold. "And yet, here you are, practicing the same forbidden arts." Draven's hand left her neck and moved to her shoulder. He pulled her slightly behind him, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed. "She saved my life," he said. "That is all that matters." Haldrick's gaze shifted between them. Calculation flickered behind his eyes. Finally, he inclined his head. "Very well, Your Majesty. If you insist the girl is useful, she shall remain as your personal physician." Westland's breath caught. Physician. A position, a rank, a lie, but also a lifeline. "Thank you, Lord Haldrick," Draven said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. The council filed out. Haldrick lingered in the doorway. He looked at Westland one last time, his expression unreadable. "Do not make me regret this decision, girl." And then he was gone. Westland sagged against the door, her legs finally giving out. Draven caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist, holding her upright. "You lied for me," she whispered. "I lied for us," he corrected. His hand moved to her face, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "You are mine, Westland Ashgrove, and I protect what is mine." The bond hummed between them, warm and undeniable. Westland closed her eyes, exhaustion and fear and something dangerous flooding through her. "What happens now?" she asked. Draven's thumb brushed over her cheek, impossibly gentle. "Now you stay, and we figure out what the hell you are." Because he knew, just as she did, that she was no null. The scent that had filled the room, the golden spark that had flared between them, the way his wolf had gone silent for the first time in 10 years. None of it made sense, unless she was something else entirely. Something the council had tried to erase, something forbidden. Westland opened her eyes and met his gaze. In the firelight, his eyes were no longer feral. They were human, warm, filled with a desperate hope she had never seen before. "I do not know what I am," she admitted. "Then we will find out together." He guided her to the armchair by the hearth, settling her into the soft velvet cushions. She was trembling, her body exhausted from the adrenaline, the fear, The overwhelming rush of the mate bond snapping into place. Draven knelt in front of her, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, caging her in, but it did not feel like a trap. It felt like safety. "Sleep," he said. "You need rest, too," she whispered. "The poison is quiet." He paused, and something raw crossed his face. "For the first time in years, it is quiet. Because of you." His hand found hers, and their fingers intertwined. The golden spark flared again, softer this time, a gentle warmth that spread through her chest. Westland's eyes drifted closed, and for the first time in 15 years, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen, and as she slipped into sleep, the Alpha King watched over her, his wolf finally at peace. Dawn broke over Ashenvale like a blade of cold light slicing through the heavy velvet curtains. Westland awoke in the armchair, her body stiff from sleeping upright, her neck aching. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the memories crashed back like a wave, the vial shattering, the scent exploding into the room, Draven's golden eyes burning into hers. The mate bond snapping into place like a chain around her soul. She sat up, heart racing, and found him watching her from across the room. Draven Thornwall stood by the window, fully dressed now in black leather and dark wool, his arms crossed over his chest. The morning light turned his hair to burnished copper, and his eyes, no longer feral gold, but a deep amber, tracked her every movement with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are still here," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but the feral rasp was gone. "You ordered me not to leave, Your Majesty." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And your guards are not exactly prone to letting nulls wander out of the royal chambers at 3 a.m. Westland stood, smoothing down her rumpled apron. Her wrists still bore the bruises from Griselda's grip, purple and ugly against her pale skin. She tucked her hands behind her back, hiding them. Draven noticed anyway. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her wrist in his hand. His touch was gentle, careful, as if she were made of glass. He turned her arm slowly, his thumb tracing the edge of the bruise with a pressure so light it was barely there. She did this. It was not a question. Westland nodded. Draven's jaw tightened. The gold flickered back into his eyes for just a moment, a flash of something predatory and furious. "I should have her exiled for touching you." "She is the head of household staff," Westland said quietly. "She has every right to discipline servants. You are not a servant anymore." His thumb continued its slow path along the bruise, feather light, and Westland became acutely aware of how close he was standing. The scent of him surrounded her, cedar and rain and something ancient that had no name, only weight. Her body responded before her mind could catch up. Her pulse quickened. Her skin warmed beneath his fingers. She felt herself lean toward him just a fraction of an inch, and the realization horrified her. She pulled her hand away and stepped back. The air between them crackled, the same electric charge that had sparked when their skin touched the night before. "The scent," Draven said, his voice dropping lower. "It is still there." Westland's heart stuttered. She had hoped, foolishly, that the effect would fade with the dawn, that without the suppressant, her scent would simply disappear, return to the nothingness she had always been. But it had not. "It is fainter than last night," Draven continued, stepping closer. "But it is there, like wild jasmine after a winter storm." He reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of dark hair away from her face. The touch sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with cold. Her body leaned again, toward him, toward the warmth, toward something she had spent her entire life denying. "Stop it," she told herself. "Stop wanting." "It is a curse," Wesleyan whispered. "I have spent my life hiding it because I knew this would happen. I did not want to be a prize. I did not want to be a cure." Draven's expression darkened. "You think I see you as a bottle of medicine, a tool to keep my wolf at bay? Do you not?" she challenged, her fear giving way to a spark of defiance. "You are the Alpha King. You are losing your mind to the shadow poison. And suddenly, the scentless defect turns out to be the only thing that can quiet the beast. It is convenient." His hand dropped from her face, and he gripped the arms of the chair behind her, leaning down until they were nose to nose. The scent of him surrounded her completely. Cedar and rain and ancient power, overwhelming and intoxicating. Her body screamed at her to close the gap. Her mind screamed at her to run. "It is many things, Wesleyan Ashgrove," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But convenient is not one of them. My council expects me to mate with Lady Rowena to solidify our borders. My people expect a queen with a lineage they can trace back 3 centuries. They will see you as a threat. They will call this witchcraft." He straightened and paced to the hearth. The fire had burned down to embers, casting his face in shadow. "But for the first time in 10 years, he continued, I woke up without the sound of screaming in my head. I woke up quiet. I cannot let that go." A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Draven's head snapped toward the sound. "What?" "Your Majesty." The voice was muffled through the heavy wood. "The High Council requests an audience regarding the Blood Moon incidents, and Matron Griselda is demanding to know the whereabouts of her headmaid." Wesleyan's stomach dropped. If Griselda found out she had survived the night, spent it in the king's rooms... Draven turned to her. "Stay here." "I cannot stay here," Wesleyan protested. "I have duties. If I do not show up, they will accuse me of theft, or worse. I am the law in this kingdom, Wesleyan." His tone shifted, becoming the authoritative voice of a king rather than the man who had traced her bruise with trembling fingers. But when he saw her pale face, his eyes softened. He walked to a small cabinet and pulled out a silk robe, tossing it to her. "Cover yourself. You are no longer a maid. From this moment, you are the king's personal physician." Wesleyan caught the robe, the fabric slipping through her fingers like water. "But I do not have the herbs anymore. They broke." Draven stepped close, tilting her chin up with one finger. "Then use the truth. Tell them you are the only one who can touch the king without being torn apart. It is a power they will fear, but they will respect it." He released her and strode toward the door. Before he opened it, he looked back, his amber eyes holding hers. "Do not leave this room until I return." Then he was gone, leaving Wesleyan alone with the silk robe and the weight of a lie that was rapidly becoming the truth. She waited for an hour, then 2. The fire died to ash and she rebuilt it, her hands moving through the motions while her mind raced. She touched the place on her throat where his fingers had rested. The skin still tingled. She pressed her palm flat against it, willing the sensation to stop. But it only deepened, spreading down through her collarbone and settling in her chest like a second heartbeat. This was the bond. She knew enough from her mother's whispered lessons to understand that. Once a mate bond activated, it did not simply fade. It grew. It demanded. And the longer she stayed near Draven Thornwall, the harder it would become to resist. Her body already knew this. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the phantom pressure of his hand on her jaw, the heat of his breath near her mouth, the almost kiss that had been stolen by the knock at the door. Her skin remembered what her mind was trying to forget. She hated it. And beneath the hatred, in the place she refused to look, she wanted more. The Royal Conservatory was a sanctuary of glass and green, a dome of crystalline panes that trapped the weak winter sunlight and turned it into something warm and golden. Draven had summoned her here after his meeting with the council. He had not told her what they discussed, but she could see the toll it had taken. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight, and the black veins that had receded during the night were creeping back toward his throat. He sat on a stone bench near a trellis of winter roses, his head in his hands. "The council?" Westlin asked softly, stepping out from behind the ivy. "Vultures," Draven rasped. He rubbed his temples, his large hands trembling slightly. "They smell blood in the water. They know the blood moon nearly broke me. They are already discussing a regency, already picking out which of them will sit on my throne while I rot in a padded cell." Westlin walked toward him, her instincts as a healer overriding her fear. She knelt before him, placing her hands on his knees. The moment their skin touched, a visible ripple of relief washed over him. His breathing slowed. The frantic pulse at his throat stilled. "You are not rotting anywhere, Draven." He looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was staggering. This was not a king. This was a man who had been alone with his pain for a decade and had forgotten what it felt like to have someone reach for him instead of recoil. "My mind is intact, for now, but the effort it takes to keep the wolf down, it is like holding back an ocean with a wooden fence. It burns, Westlin. Every second of every day, it burns." Without thinking, she reached up and took his hands in hers. The golden spark flared again, warm and bright, and Draven exhaled shakily. "Show me," she said quietly. "Show you what?" "Your scars, not the ones on your back, the ones you hide." He hesitated. Then slowly he unbuttoned his tunic and pulled it aside to reveal the mark over his heart. Westlin's breath caught. The shadow poison mark was worse than she had imagined. A jagged, darkened web spread from a central point just above his heart, pulsing with faint, sickly purple light. Black veins radiated outward like the roots of a dying tree, crawling up toward his collarbone, down toward his ribs. "A shadow-poisoned blade," Draven explained, his voice hollow. "From the Great War. 10 years ago. The Eastern Kingdom's assassins used them. The blade itself was nothing, just steel. But the poison, it feeds on alpha rage. The angrier I get, the more it spreads. The council thinks I am losing my mind to my nature. But it is this. I am being eaten alive from the inside out." Westlin's heart broke for him. This man, who everyone feared as a tyrant, was a soldier dying a slow, lonely death in a gilded palace. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the mark. She could feel the heat of it, the wrongness pulsing beneath his skin. Her hand trembled. Every nerve in her body screamed at her not to touch it. But something deeper, something older than fear, pulled her forward. Her fingertips made contact with the edge of the mark. Draven hissed through his teeth. His hand shot up and caught her wrist, but he did not pull her away. He held her there, his grip tight, his breathing ragged. "Does it hurt?" she whispered. "Only when I am alone," he confessed. His voice cracked on the last word, and the sound of it shattered something inside her. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against her shoulder. "When I can smell you, the poison goes cold. It is like the sun coming out after a century of night." Wesleyan felt tears slip down her cheeks. She had spent her entire life feeling broken, invisible, a mistake of nature, a girl with no scent in a world where scent was everything. But here, in this glass cathedral of winter light, holding the head of a dying king against her shoulder, she realized something that rearranged the architecture of her soul. She was not broken. She was the only person on earth who could offer him peace. She was not a null. She was a sanctuary. "I will find a way to heal this," she promised, her voice gaining strength. "I may not have the royal library's knowledge, but I know the old ways. My mother taught me that every poison has a shadow, and every shadow has a light." Draven pulled back, his amber eyes searching hers. For the first time, there was no dominance in them, only profound, aching gratitude. "Why are you doing this, Wesleyan? I took you captive. I forced you into this lie." "Because," she said, wiping her eyes and offering him a small, shaky smile, "I know what it is like to be a monster in the eyes of everyone else, and I know you are not one." He cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away her tears. He leaned in, and Wesleyan's breath hitched. This was it. The kiss that had been interrupted the night before. His lips were an inch from hers, his breath warm against her skin. "When I kiss you, Wesleyan," he whispered, his voice rough with desire and restraint, "I will not stop until you are claimed before the entire pack. I will not stop until everyone knows you are mine." Her heart thundered. Her body screamed yes. Every cell, every nerve ending, every suppressed instinct she had buried for 15 years surged toward him like a tide she could no longer hold back. She closed her eyes. She tilted her face up. She could feel the heat of his mouth, so close, but he did not close the distance. His forehead pressed against hers. His breathing was ragged, his hands shaking where they held her face. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not until you say the word. Not until you choose this. I will not take what is not freely given." Wesleyan opened her eyes. He was right there, his lips a whisper from hers, his eyes burning amber, every muscle in his body coiled with the effort of restraint, the most powerful alpha in the kingdom holding himself back. For her, because she had not said yes, and the terrifying thing was how badly she wanted to say it. She began. The crash of shattering glass echoed through the conservatory. They both turned to see Matron Griselda standing by the entrance, a basket of fallen rose petals at her feet. Her face was twisted in a mask of pure vitriolic hatred. "So," the head maid hissed, her eyes darting between Wesleyan's hands on the king's bare chest and Draven's half-dressed state. The little scentless rat did not just find her voice. She found her way into the king's bed. Draven stood, his posture shifting from vulnerable man to commanding alpha in the space of a single heartbeat. "Matron Griselda, leave. Now." "I will leave, Your Majesty." Griselda sneered, backing toward the door. "But the council will be very interested to know that their king is being healed by a servant who practices the dark arts of seduction." She turned and fled, her footsteps echoing down the marble corridor. The peace of the conservatory vanished, replaced by the cold weight of a coming storm. Westlin looked at Draven, dread settling in her gut. "She is going to tell them," she whispered. Draven pulled his tunic closed, his jaw set. The vulnerability was gone. In its place stood the cold, hard steel of a king who had survived a decade of war and poison and betrayal. Let her. He looked at her, and beneath the steel, she saw the man who had pressed his forehead to hers and chosen to wait. "I am tired of hiding, Westlin. If they want a war, I will give them one. But they will not take you from me." The throne room was a cavern of cold marble and echoing judgment. High above, stained glass windows depicted the history of the Thornwall lineage. Great wolves tearing through enemies, alphas standing victorious over fallen kingdoms. But today, the atmosphere felt less like a celebration of power and more like an execution. Westlin stood in the center of the floor, stripped of her physician's coat and forced back into the simple drab linen of a maid. It was a calculated move by the High Council, a reminder of her place, of where she belonged, of what she was, or what they believed she was. Standing in a semicircle before her were 5 council elders, their scents heavy with old parchment, sour musk, and a sharpening aggression that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Lord Haldrick stood at the center, his silver hair gleaming in the dim light, his face carved from the same stone as the walls around them. Behind her, elevated on the black obsidian throne, sat Draven. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her back. The bond between them hummed with a low, constant vibration, like a plucked string that had not yet gone silent. She did not turn. She knew that if she saw the pain in his eyes, her courage would crumble. "Westlin Ashgrove," Haldrick began, his voice like dry leaves skittering over stone. "A null, a shifter with no scent, no rank, and until 2 days ago, no voice. You stand accused of high seduction and the use of forbidden scent magic to manipulate the Alpha King's mind." The words fell on her like stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples of whispered commentary through the gathered crowd behind the council. She heard the words they used: witch, whore, null trash. She had heard them all before. They had lost the power to wound her years ago. What wounded her now was something else entirely. The knowledge that the man behind her was being forced to watch this, and that every protective instinct in his body was screaming at him to intervene. She could feel it through the bond, his rage like a furnace door rattling on its hinges. Stay still, she thought, hoping the bond carried meaning as well as feeling. Let me do this. I have used no magic, Westlin said. Her voice was small, but it did not waver. Matron Griselda testifies that she found you in a state of undress with His Majesty, Haldrick continued, a cruel sneer curling his lip. She claims the air was thick with a scent that should not exist. Tell me, girl, how does a scentless null suddenly smell like a siren's trap? Unless you are using blood alchemy to mask your true nature. Westlin's hands clenched at her sides. She thought of her mother standing before this same council. Different faces, same hunger, the same appetite for someone to burn. It was not alchemy, she said. I was hiding. I used herbs to suppress my heat because I did not want to be a pawn in your games. She lifted her chin. I am not a null. I am different. A ripple of mocking laughter went through the room. Different. The word bounced off the marble walls like a bad joke. Different, Haldrick repeated, his tone dripping with contempt. You are a servant who saw an opportunity to bed a king while he was weak. Enough. The sound of Draven's voice was like a thunderclap. He stood from the throne, and his presence filled the room until the air felt thin and insufficient. He descended the steps, his boots clicking a rhythmic percussion on the marble, each step deliberate and measured. He did not rush. Rushing would imply urgency. Urgency would imply fear. And a king did not fear his own counsel. He stopped directly behind Wesleyan, close enough that she could feel the heat of him at her back, close enough that his scent wrapped around her like armor. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His proximity was a declaration. "Lord Haldrick," Draven said, his voice dangerously low, "you speak of my weakness as if it is a political talking point. You forget that while I fought the shadow war on the front lines, you were tucked away in your libraries, counting your gold and your grievances." Haldrick's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. The old wolf had not survived 5 decades of court politics by flinching. "With respect, Your Majesty, the law is clear. A king must mate with an alpha or a high omega to ensure the strength of the bloodline. To take a thing like this as a consort is to invite the collapse of our biology." The word landed in the room like a slap. Thing. Wesleyan felt Draven's aura shift behind her. The bond between them went taut, vibrating with something dark and dangerous. She could feel the shadow poison over his heart, reacting to his anger. The purple light beginning to bleed through the fabric of his shirt. He was reaching his limit. "A thing," Draven repeated, and his voice had dropped to a register that was no longer entirely human. "You dare call her a thing in my presence." "She has bewitched you, Your Majesty," Haldrick argued, pressing forward with the confidence of a man who believed the law was his shield. "The code demands you undergo the ritual of purging, or we will be forced to declare you unfit to rule." The threat hung in the air like poison fog. Declaring a king unfit during a blood moon cycle was a death sentence. He would be stripped of his title and left in the feral woods to be hunted by his own guards. Wesleyan's stomach turned to ice. "You want a ritual of purging?" Draven asked. His voice was calm now. Too calm. The calm of a man who had made a decision that could not be unmade. "Fine. But we shall do it the old way. By the blood trial." The council went silent. Not the performative silence of political theater. True silence, the kind that falls over a room when someone has just pulled the pin from a grenade. Wesleyan's breath stopped. She knew what the blood trial was. Everyone did. An ancient, brutal test where a mate's worth was proven through a physical and spiritual link. If the bond was false, both participants died. If it was true, the council's authority over mating decisions was permanently revoked. It had not been invoked in over 200 years. The last pair who attempted it had burned alive from the inside out. "Draven, no." Wesleyan turned, breaking her composure for the first time. She looked up at him, and the fear in her eyes was not for herself. "You are too weak for the trial. The poison will kill you." He looked down at her, and the expression on his face was the most devastating thing she had ever seen. Not anger, not defiance, tenderness. A sad, beautiful smile that said he had already made peace with the possibility of what he was about to do. He reached out, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. "I would rather die in the trial with you, Wesleyan, than live 1,000 years as a king without you." He turned back to the council. His voice boomed through the hall, carrying to every corner, every shadow, every ear. 3 days from now, under the waning moon, Wesleyan Ashgrove will prove she is no null. And I will prove she is my queen. If we fail, the throne is yours, Lord Haldrick. If we succeed, you will be stripped of your titles and exiled." Haldrick's eyes widened. A flicker of fear crossed his face, quick as a flame, and then it was gone, smothered by decades of practiced composure. He nodded slowly. "Accepted. Guards, take the girl to the high tower. She is to have no contact with the king until the trial begins." 2 guards stepped forward and gripped Westland's arms. She looked up at Draven, her heart screaming words her mouth could not form. He leaned in close, his lips brushing her ear, and whispered words meant only for her. "Do not stop breathing my name, Westland. I will find you in the dark." And then she was pulled away, dragged from the throne room, through the cold corridor, and up the winding stairs, leaving Draven standing alone in the center of the vultures, the shadow over his heart pulsing like a dying star. The high tower was less a room and more a cage of stone and wind. Perched at the highest point of the palace, the air was thin and bitingly cold. A single narrow window looked out over the kingdom, and through it, Westland could see the flickering torches of Ashenvale far below, a scattering of amber light against the darkness. Her eyes were fixed on the royal wing. Somewhere behind those walls, Draven was fighting the encroaching darkness. Alone, the bond ached, a physical sensation, like a bruise pressed against the inside of her ribs. She had not expected that. The books her mother had kept hidden spoke of mate bonds as spiritual connections, threads of light woven between souls. They did not mention the pain, the constant gnawing absence that settled in her bones the moment they were separated. She paced the small circular floor, her footsteps echoing the frantic rhythm of her heart. The guards had stripped her of nearly everything. Her physician's coat, the silk robe Draven had given her, even her apron, but they had not found the small leather pouch of dried herbs hidden in the hem of her skirt. She emptied them onto the stone table. Crushed lavender, dried sage, a few withered petals of moonlily. It was a healer's kit for a common cold, not a remedy for a king's curse. Desperate, she turned her attention to the room itself. The high tower had once been an observatory for the kingdom's mages before the wars, before the council had deemed magic too dangerous. In the corners, hidden under layers of dust and cobwebs, she found old jars of minerals and forgotten scrolls. She pulled out a crumbling piece of parchment, her hands trembling as she unrolled it. The script was ancient, written in a dialect she could barely read, but the diagrams were clear. Anatomical drawings, hormonal pathways, scent gland structures she recognized from her mother's teachings, but more detailed than anything she had ever seen. It was not a spell. It was a biological chart of something called the primal omega. No, not omega. Scent eater. Westland's breath caught as she read the ancient text, her fingers tracing words that rearranged everything she thought she knew about herself. A null was not missing a scent. They were absorbers. Their bodies acted as natural filters, designed to absorb and neutralize the excess aggression and toxic energy of their alpha counterparts. They were not defects. They were the opposite. They were the balance, the biological answer to a problem the pack had never understood. I am not just a match for him, Westland realized, her hands shaking so violently the parchment rattled. I am his antidote. The reason Draven felt peace in her presence was not simply because she smelled good. Her very biology was pulling the shadow poison out of him, filtering it, purifying it. Every moment they spent close, every touch, every breath of her scent that reached his lungs, the poison retreated. But the process was incomplete. For a permanent cure, she needed to trigger a complete synthesis, a rare event described in the scroll as blood synthesis, where the scent eater willingly takes the full weight of the Alpha's curse into their own body to purify it. The cost was staggering. The scroll warned that the scent eater would experience the full agony of the absorbed toxin. Some survived. Many did not. Westland sat back on her heels and stared at the parchment. 3 days. She had 3 days until the blood trial. 3 days in which Draven would be alone with the poison, separated from the only source of relief he had found in 10 years. 3 days in which the shadow would continue to spread. He might not last 3 days. Far below, in the royal wing, Draven sat in his private study with his shirt torn open and his head bowed. The fire had burned low, casting the room in shadow, and the cold had crept in to take its place. He could feel the poison moving. It had a rhythm now, a pulse that was faster than his heartbeat, as if it had its own agenda, its own hunger. When Westland was near, the poison went cold, dormant, like a snake charmed into sleep by a sound it could not resist. But she had been gone for hours now, and the snake was waking. He could feel it coiling around his heart, tightening with each breath. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back, not to the war, not to the blade that had pierced his chest, but to before, to the moment when he had first felt the poison take hold and understood, with perfect clarity, that he was going to spend the rest of his life in a cage built from his own body. 10 years. 10 years of waking up to screaming inside his skull. 10 years of keeping his wolf chained so tightly that sometimes he forgot what it felt like to simply breathe. 10 years of watching his counsel circle him like patient predators, waiting for the moment his grip slipped and the beast inside broke free. He had stopped attending gatherings because the scent of 300 bodies in one room turned the screaming into a roar. He had stopped holding court because the effort of maintaining control while surrounded by aggressive alphas left him bedridden for days afterward. He had stopped sleeping because the nightmares were worse than the waking hours, and in dreams the poison spoke to him in a voice that sounded like his own. "End it," the voice would say. "Let go. Let the wolf take over. It will be quiet then. It will finally be quiet." But last night, for the first time in a decade, the voice had stopped. Westland Ashgrove had walked into his room carrying a silver tray and a lie about being nothing. And the moment her true scent had touched the air, every screaming thing inside him had gone still. Not suppressed, not controlled. Still, as if the storm had simply ended. He pressed his palm against the shadow mark on his chest. It pulsed beneath his hand, angry and hot, but fainter than it had been yesterday. Where her fingers had hovered over it in the conservatory, the skin was almost cool. She was saving him, one touch at a time, one breath at a time, and they had taken her away. He thought of her face in the throne room, the way she had lifted her chin and told 5 of the most powerful men in the kingdom that she was not a null. She was different. The defiance in her voice. The way her hands had trembled at her sides, even as her words held steady. She was terrified, and she had stood there anyway. That was not witchcraft. That was not seduction. That was courage in its purest, most painful form. And they had called her a thing. He pressed his fists against his eyes and breathed through the rage. The poison surged with it, feeding on the anger, and he forced himself to unclench, to breathe, to think of her scent instead of their words, Jasmine and honey, winter and warmth. 3 days. He had to survive 3 days. But 3 days was a mercy he would not be granted. A small scratching sound came from the window of the high tower. Westland spun around. A small gray wolf pup was squeezing through the gap between the iron bars, its body barely fitting through the narrow space. It tumbled onto the stone floor, shook itself, and looked up at her with bright golden eyes. Around its neck was a silk ribbon, stained with a drop of black, oily blood. Westland knelt and untied the ribbon with shaking fingers. The blood on it throbbed with a sickly purple light that pulsed in the dim room like a tiny, dying heart. Draven's blood, and the shadow poison in it was unmistakable, reaching, spreading. The darkness in the droplet was deeper than it had been the night before. The poison was reaching his heart. If she did not act tonight, there would be no king left to stand trial. She pressed the ribbon against her chest and felt the bond flare in response. A surge of warmth that cut through the cold of the tower like a blade. He was alive. He was fighting. But he was losing. Westland looked at the parchment spread across the stone table. Blood synthesis. The scroll's warnings were clear. The scent eater takes the poison into herself. The agony is absolute. Survival is not guaranteed. But the alternative was watching him die from a tower window while she did nothing. She had watched her mother die while doing nothing. She had been 8 years old and helpless and hiding behind barrels while the flames rose. She had promised herself in the year since that she would never stand by again, never watch, never hide. She was done hiding. "Listen to me," she whispered to the pup, her voice thick with urgency. "You have to get back to him. Tell him to open the ventilation shafts. Tell him I am coming." The pup tilted its head. Then it turned, squeezed back through the bars, and disappeared into the night. Westland stood. She knew the architecture of the palace from her years as a maid. Every corridor, every passage, every forgotten space that the nobles never noticed because servants were meant to be invisible. The high tower was connected to the king's chambers through a series of narrow service tunnels used to heat the rooms during winter. Vertical shafts lined with stone, choked with soot and heat. It was a route no sane person would attempt. But she had never been given the luxury of sanity. She tore a strip of fabric from her dress and soaked it in water from her wash basin, tying it around her face. She grabbed the moon lily petals and the shadow poison ribbon, tucking them into her bodice. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Every poison has a shadow. Every shadow has a light. She found the rusted floor grate in the corner of the room and pried it loose with strength that surprised her. The dark, narrow shaft yawned beneath her, a throat of blackness and unknown danger. Westland lowered herself to the edge. The heat from below was already pressing against her skin. The stone was jagged. The passage was barely wide enough for her shoulders. She thought of Draven, alone in his study. The poison wrapping around his heart like a fist. The screaming in his head returning, louder than before. She thought of her mother, standing at the stake with calm eyes and silent lips. Hide. Be strong. Survive. No, Westland thought. Not this time. This time, I do not hide. This time, I go toward the fire. She slid into the darkness, and the tower swallowed her whole. The crawl was agonizing. Stone tore at her hands and knees, each edge a small blade that opened skin and drew thin lines of blood across her palms. The shaft was narrower than she had imagined, barely wider than her shoulders, and the walls pressed against her on both sides like the throat of some ancient beast slowly swallowing her whole. The heat from the lower furnaces rose in waves, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe, even through the wet cloth tied over her mouth. But Westland did not stop. She could feel it now. The pull, a psychic tug deep in her gut that grew stronger with every inch she descended. It was not thought, it was not logic. It was something older, something woven into the very marrow of her bones, her scent-eater nature acting like a compass, drawing her toward the source of the toxicity she was born to heal, toward him. The shaft twisted, narrowed. She scraped her shoulder against a jutting stone and bit down on her lip to keep from crying out. Blood trickled down her arm, warm and bright against the soot that coated her skin. She could smell herself now, her true scent leaking through the sweat and grime, winter jasmine and honey, faint but unmistakable, rising from her like steam. How strange, she thought. 15 years of hiding it. 15 years of bitter chamomile and crushed lavender and silver bark root, all to keep this part of herself locked away. And now it was the very thing guiding her through the dark. The shaft leveled out and she found herself crawling horizontally through a tunnel, barely tall enough to fit her body. The stone beneath her hands changed from rough-hewn to smooth, and she recognized the craftsmanship. Royal wing. She was close. Finally, she reached a vent that looked down into a room below. Draven's private study. Westland pressed her face to the grate, and her heart clenched so hard she thought it might stop. He was slumped in the chair by the dead hearth. His shirt was torn open. The shadow mark over his heart had grown into a sprawling web of black veins that reached up toward his throat and down toward his stomach, pulsing with a light that was no longer purple, but nearly black. His skin was gray. His breathing was shallow and ragged, each exhale a sound like paper tearing. His hands hung at his sides, limp, the fingers curled inward as if even the effort of making a fist was beyond him. He looked like a man who had already begun to die and was simply waiting for his body to catch up. Westland kicked the vent open. The grate gave way with a shriek of rusted metal, and she dropped through the opening, landing in a heap of torn silk, soot, and blood on the study floor. Pain shot through her ankles, and her knees buckled, but she was up again in seconds, scrambling across the cold stone toward him. Westland. Her name in his mouth was a ghost of a sound. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled, and he fell back into the chair. His eyes flickered between gold and gray, the wolf and the man fighting for control of a body that was failing them both. Go back. If they find you here, they will kill you. Let them try, she said. She was at his side in a heartbeat, her hands on his face, tilting it up toward hers. His skin was cold. Not the cold of winter, but the cold of something leaving. The warmth was being pulled out of him, consumed by the darkness spreading through his veins. I know how to fix this, Draven, but it is going to hurt. A broken sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a groan. Everything hurts. She looked into his eyes. The gold was nearly gone, drowned by gray, and for the first time she saw fear in them. Not fear of dying, fear of losing her, fear that this broken, poisoned body would be the thing that stole her from the world. Do you trust me? She asked. With my life, he whispered. With whatever is left of it. Westland reached into her bodice and pulled out the ancient scroll. She did not need to read it again. The words were burned into her memory. Blood synthesis. The scent eater willingly takes the full weight of the Alpha's curse into her own body. The agony is absolute. Survival is not guaranteed. She set the scroll aside and looked at her palm. The cuts from the shaft were still open, blood welling in thin red lines across her skin. She would not need to cut deeper. Westlin! Draven's hand found her wrist. His grip was weak, trembling, but his eyes were suddenly sharp. What are you about to do? What I was born to do. She pressed her bloody palm directly against the pulsing black mark on his chest. The contact was electric. The room tilted. A sound like 1,000 screaming winds filled the chamber, though the curtains hung motionless and the air did not stir. It was not a sound that came from outside. It came from inside, from the place where the bond connected them, the invisible thread that tied her soul to his, now burning white-hot with something that was neither pain nor pleasure, but something beyond both. Draven's back arched. His scream caught in his throat, trapped there like a living thing, and his hands flew to her waist and gripped with bruising force. The black veins under his skin began to move, not spreading, retreating, writhing. They were being pulled toward the point of contact, toward her bloody hand on his chest, drawn by a force that was older than magic and more fundamental than science. Westlin felt it enter her, cold, oily, a darkness that crept up her arm like ink spreading through water. It moved beneath her skin, pushing into her veins, and with it came the pain. Not the sharp, clean pain of a wound, but something deeper, something that reached into the core of her and squeezed. She felt what Draven had felt for 10 years, the screaming, the endless, shapeless rage that had no source and no target, that simply existed, pressing against the inside of the skull like a sound that would never stop. This was what he had carried. Every day, every night, for a decade. She nearly let go. The instinct to pull her hand away was overwhelming, a survival response screaming louder than the poison itself. But she held on. She held on because she remembered the look in his eyes in the conservatory, when he had said, "Only when I am alone." She held on because she remembered her mother on the stake, choosing not to scream. She held on because some things in this world were worth the burning. "Hold on to me," she gasped, her vision blurring. "Draven, do not let go." His hands found new purchase. One arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. The other hand pressed over hers on his chest, holding it against the mark as if afraid she would be torn away. His face was inches from hers. She could see the veins in his neck writhing, retreating, pulling back toward the mark, and then out of him, into her. The purple light of the curse began to move. It flowed from his chest through her palm and into her own veins, and she watched with a detached horror as thin dark lines appeared on her forearm, crawling upward like roots seeking soil. The cold deepened. Her heart stuttered. For one terrifying moment, she thought it would stop altogether. Then something miraculous happened. Her heat, long suppressed, locked behind 15 years of herbs and willpower and fear, ignited. It did not come gently. It came like a door blown off its hinges by a storm that had been building since the day she was born. Heat flooded her body from the inside out. Her skin flushed. Her scent, already present, exploded into something so potent it was nearly visible, a shimmering golden mist that poured from her skin and filled the room like sunlight made tangible. And the poison met it. The dark lines crawling up her arm collided with the heat coursing through her blood, and the two forces clashed inside her body like opposing armies. She felt the poison try to take hold, try to dig its roots into her the way it had dug into Draven for a decade. But her blood did not accept it. Her blood did not absorb it and let it grow. Her blood burned it alive. The golden light intensified. The room was no longer dark. It blazed with a radiance that turned the shadows into memory, that made the stone walls glow as if lit from within. The scent of winter jasmine and ancient honey became so powerful that it was no longer just a smell, but a presence, a living thing that pushed back the darkness with the quiet, absolute authority of dawn erasing night. Draven gasped beneath her. His grip on her waist tightened, then loosened, then tightened again as wave after wave of the poison was pulled from his body and annihilated in hers. The gray pallor of his skin retreated. Color returned. The black veins shriveled and vanished one by one, retreating from his throat, his shoulders, his arms, until only the mark over his heart remained. And then that too was gone. In its place, smooth, unscarred skin, and something new, a faint, glowing brand in the shape of a crescent moon, pulsing with soft, golden light. Westland slumped against him. Her body trembled with an exhaustion so complete it felt like her bones had been hollowed out and filled with sand. The heat still raged through her, uncontrolled and demanding, and she was aware, with a clarity that cut through the fog of exhaustion, that she was pressed against his bare chest, that his arms were around her, that her face was buried in the curve of his neck, where his scent was strongest. Cedar and rain and something new, something clean and bright that had not been there before. She had purified him, but the heat was not finished with her. It rolled through her body in waves, each one stronger than the last, each one pulling at something deep inside her, a need so fundamental it felt less like desire and more like gravity. Her skin burned where it touched his. Her breath came in shallow gasps that had nothing to do with the exertion of the synthesis, and everything to do with the man whose heartbeat she could feel against her own. 15 years. She had suppressed this for 15 years. And now the dam had not just cracked, it had been obliterated. Westlin. Draven's voice was different, rich, full. The rasp of pain was gone, replaced by a depth and warmth that vibrated through his chest and into her body, where they were pressed together. His hands moved up her back, slow and careful, and she felt the question in his touch. The restraint. Even now. Even with her trembling against him, her scent flooding the room, her body making its demands with a transparency that mortified her thinking mind. Even now, he waited. Westlin, look at me. She pulled back enough to see his face. The gray was gone entirely. His skin was warm, alive, lit from within by a vitality she had never seen in him. His eyes were clear amber, steady and present, and when they met hers, she saw something that stole the last of her resistance. Wonder, gratitude, and a wanting that matched her own. The synthesis is complete, she managed. The poison is gone. I know. His hand came up to cup her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, the same gesture from the first night, but different now. Slower, more deliberate, as if he were memorizing the shape of her. But that is not why you are shaking. She closed her eyes. He was right, and she hated him for it, and she loved him for it in the same breath. The heat was not a choice, but what she did with it was, "This is the bond," she said, "and the heat. It hit when the synthesis broke through the suppression. I cannot control it." "I know," he said again. His forehead pressed against hers. She could feel his breath, warm and even, against her lips. "And I need you to hear me, Westlin. Hear me clearly. This is forever. It is not something we can undo. If we complete this bond, you are mine, and I am yours until one of us stops breathing. Do you understand? Yes? And I need you to be sure. Not because the heat demands it. Not because the bond is pulling at you. I need you to choose this with the part of yourself that is still thinking clearly. She opened her eyes. He was right there, so close that the world behind him ceased to exist. She could see the gold flecks in his amber irises. She could see the tiny scar at the corner of his mouth. She could see the fear buried beneath the steadiness of his gaze. Fear that she would say no. Fear that she would say yes for the wrong reasons. And beneath the fear, something else. Something that had nothing to do with wolves or bonds or biology. Something purely, devastatingly human. He loved her. The realization bloomed through her like the golden light that had filled the room during the synthesis. Not sudden, not shocking. It had been there since the first night, growing in the quiet moments, in the way he had traced her bruise with trembling fingers, in the way he had pressed his forehead to hers in the conservatory and chosen not to kiss her because she had not said yes, in the way he had stood in front of a council of vultures and wagered his throne on a bond he had known for less than 2 days. He loved her, and he was terrified she would mistake the heat for an answer. "I have been sure," Westland said, her voice steady and certain and entirely her own. "Since the moment I did not run when I walked into your room that night, I could have turned around. The guards would not have stopped me. But I saw you, Draven, and I stayed. Not because I was brave, because something in me recognized something in you, and I have been walking toward you ever since." A sound left his throat, not a growl, not a word, something between a prayer and a breaking. His mouth found hers. The kiss was everything the interrupted moments had promised. It was not gentle. It was not careful. It was the release of a pressure that had been building since the moment she had stepped into his room 2 nights ago, since the moment her scent had hit the air and the universe had rearranged itself around the two of them. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, and she melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as if letting go would mean falling off the edge of the world. The bond sang between them, not hummed, not whispered, sang. A frequency that resonated in every cell of her body, that turned her blood to light and her breath to music. The golden mist of her scent thickened, swirling around them both like a cocoon, and where it touched his skin, it left warmth, and where his skin touched hers, it left fire. She felt the bond complete itself, not with a snap as it had that first night, but with a deepening, a settling, like a river finding its course after years of running wild. The crescent moon brand on his chest blazed with golden light, and Westland gasped against his mouth as she felt a matching heat bloom over her own heart, a mark forming beneath her skin. The same crescent moon, glowing in answer to his, pulsing in the same rhythm, as if their hearts had decided to beat in unison and would never again remember how to beat alone. Something else stirred inside her. Power. Not the frantic surge of the synthesis, but something quieter and more certain. A shield. A projection. The ability to extend her scent outward like a wall. A barrier of peace that could calm a feral wolf or shatter a weapon forged in darkness. The power of a scent eater fully awakened, fully realized, fully claimed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Draven rested his forehead against hers. His hands cradled her face as if she were the most precious thing he had ever held. And his eyes, when she opened hers, were not the eyes of a king. They were the eyes of a man who had just been pulled from the bottom of a very deep ocean and was seeing sunlight for the first time. "The screaming," he said. His voice was rough with emotion. "It is gone, Westlin. Not quiet. Not suppressed. Gone. I can hear my own thoughts for the first time in 10 years. She touched his chest where the shadow mark had been. Smooth skin. Warm. The crescent moon brand pulsed gently under her fingertips, and she felt the answering pulse over her own heart. "You are free," she whispered. "We are free," he corrected. He pulled her into his lap and wrapped his arms around her, holding her against his chest. His heartbeat was strong and steady beneath her ear. Not the frantic, poisoned rhythm she had felt during the synthesis. A real heartbeat. A healthy heartbeat. The heartbeat of a man who had been dying for a decade and had just been handed back his life. "Tell me about the night your mother died," he said quietly. Not a demand. A request. An offering of space. Westlin closed her eyes. She had never told anyone. Not in 15 years. The memory was a locked room inside her, and she had never trusted anyone enough to hand them the key. But the bond was open between them now. She could feel his emotions like a second heartbeat. His grief for her. His anger at the council. His tenderness, soft and vast. Like snow falling in a silent field. He was not asking because he was curious. He was asking because he wanted to carry it with her. So she told him. The gray sky, the smoke, the barrels she had hidden behind, her mother's amber eyes finding hers across the square, the words mouthed in silence. Hide, be strong, survive, and the flames. He held her tighter. He did not try to fix it. He did not offer platitudes. He simply held her and let her speak, and when she was finished, he pressed his lips to her forehead and said, "She would be proud of you. What you did tonight. She would be so proud." And then he told her his. The Great War. The front lines. The assassin's blade that had slipped between the gaps in his armor and found his heart. The moment the shadow poison took hold. A cold so absolute it burned. Waking up in a field of dead soldiers and realizing he was the only one left alive and wishing he was not. 10 years of screaming. 10 years of his council circling like wolves waiting for him to fall. 10 years of sleeping alone in a room full of weapons, because some nights the only thing stopping the poison from winning was the knowledge that if he lost control, his guards would put him down before he could hurt anyone. "I thought about letting them," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "More than once. The silence seemed worth it." Westlin reached up and pressed her hand over the crescent moon on his chest. The golden light pulsed beneath her touch. "You will never be silent again," she said, "and you will never be alone." He looked at her, and the love in his eyes was not the desperate, grasping thing she had feared love would be. It was not a cage. It was not a leash. It was the open door she had been searching for her entire life. "You are mine, Westlin Ashgrove," he said, "and I am yours, now and forever." The crescent marks on their chests glowed in unison, pulsing softly in the quiet room. Outside, the wind had stopped. The blizzard that had raged for days had gone still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. For a moment, there was peace. True, complete peace. The kind that settles into the space between two people who have stopped running from each other and from themselves. The heavy doors to Draven's study exploded inward with a violence that shook the walls. Lord Haldrick stood in the threshold, flanked by a dozen royal guards in silver armor. Their spears were leveled. Their faces were hard. Behind them, matron Griselda, her face twisted with triumphant malice, her finger pointing at Westland like a blade. "Treason!" Haldrick bellowed. His voice shook the chandelier above. "The girl has escaped her tower and used blood magic to assault the king. Guards, seize her. Execute her on the spot." The guards surged forward, but they stopped. Because the man standing before them was not the dying king they had expected to find. Draven rose from the chair, lifting Westland effortlessly in his arms, holding her against his chest. He radiated power so immense the air around him hummed with it. The shadow was gone. The gray was gone. The trembling, struggling shell of a poisoned king was gone. In his place stood an alpha in full. "Step back," Draven commanded. It was not just a king's order. It was the alpha's command. Pure and absolute. A sound that bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the wolf inside every guard in the room. Their knees buckled. 2 of them dropped their spears. One pressed his hands to his throat as if an invisible force was compressing his windpipe. "She has bewitched you," Griselda shrieked from behind the wall of struggling guards. "Look at the air. It is foul with her scent. Foul." Draven stepped forward. The golden mist of Westland's scent swirled around him like a royal cloak, and in the torchlight it shimmered with a beauty that made the accusation absurd. "You are blind, woman," Draven said, his voice cold as winter steel. "This is the scent of the High Omega. This is the scent of the woman who just saved your king and your kingdom from a curse you were too cowardly to acknowledge." Haldrick's face went pale as bone. His eyes had found Draven's chest, and the sight that met him there drained the color from his world. The shadow mark was gone. The web of black veins that had been devouring the king for a decade had vanished. In their place, smooth skin and a faint, glowing crescent moon brand. "That is impossible," Haldrick whispered. "The shadow poison cannot be cured. Every healer in the kingdom tried. Every mage. By your laws, perhaps," Draven interrupted. "But Westland Ashgrove does not follow your laws. She is a scent eater, a peace bringer. The very legend your ancestors tried to erase so you could keep your alphas in a state of perpetual war." Westland stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at the council members, at the guards with their weapons half raised, at Haldrick's expression of dawning horror, and she felt no fear. She was done being afraid. "I am not a defect," she said, her voice echoing through the study. "And I am not a prize. I am the balance you tried to destroy." She pushed gently against Draven's chest, and he set her down, though his hand remained at her waist, steadying her. Westland stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, and faced Lord Haldrick. The man who had killed her mother. He stood 10 feet away, close enough for her to see the web of broken veins on his nose, the deep lines carved around his mouth, the slight tremor in his left hand that he hid by gripping the pommel of his ceremonial sword. He was 55 years old, and he looked every year of it, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. Even now, even with his greatest weapon stripped away and his king standing whole and healed before him, Haldrick was searching for an angle. 20 years ago, Westland said, her voice steady and clear, you ordered the execution of every scent eater in Ashenvale. You called it the Purge. You burned them at the stake and called it justice. Haldrick's jaw clenched, but he did not deny it. My mother was one of them. Westland continued, and the words, long buried, rose from her like smoke from embers that had never fully died. Marin Ashgrove. She was a healer. She eased pain. She saved lives. And you burned her alive while I watched from the shadows. I was 8 years old. A collective intake of breath moved through the guards. Even Griselda took a step back, her triumph fading into something less certain. I did what had to be done, Haldrick said, but his voice lacked the granite authority it had carried in the throne room. It was quieter now, worn at the edges. Tell me why, Westland said, not a demand, a request. And the quietness of it was more disarming than any accusation. Haldrick was silent for a long moment. His eyes moved from Westland to Draven and back again, and something shifted in his expression. The political mask slipped, and beneath it she saw something she had not expected. Pain, old and deep, and never properly mourned. My brother, Haldrick said at last, Aldric. He was the finest alpha I ever knew, stronger than me, kinder than me. He should have been the one standing in my position, not me. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the name. He mated a scent eater, a woman named Yvain. She was remarkable. She could calm a feral wolf with a touch. She could walk into a room full of raging alphas and bring silence. He paused. His hand tightened on his sword. They were happy, deliriously, recklessly happy. The kind of happiness that makes everyone around it either envious or afraid. I was both. Another pause, longer this time. And then she died. Childbirth. The baby did not survive either, and my brother, his voice broke. The bond severed, and Aldric went feral, not slowly, not gradually, instantly. One moment he was a man holding his dead wife. The next he was something else. Something with no mind and no mercy. He killed 12 people before we cornered him. 12 innocents. Mothers. Children. Haldric closed his eyes. I was the one who put the blade through his heart. My own brother. I held him while he died, and the last thing he said was her name. The silence in the room was absolute. Westland stared at him. She had spent 15 years constructing Haldric in her mind as a monster, a cold, calculating predator who had burned her mother for power, for control, for the simple pleasure of watching the different ones suffer. She had built him from hatred and memory and the smell of smoke, and the construction had been so solid, so real, that it had become a wall inside her. A wall that kept the grief contained and the rage directed and the world simple enough to survive in. And now, standing before the real man, she felt that wall crack. Not crumble, not collapse. Crack. Just enough to let in a sliver of something complicated and unwelcome. Understanding. He had been wrong. Profoundly, catastrophically wrong. His fear had led him to commit an atrocity that echoed through generations. But the fear itself had been born from love. From the unendurable pain of watching his brother destroyed by a loss so complete that death was the only mercy left. It did not make it right. Nothing made it right. But it made him human. And that was harder to face than a monster. I think, Westland said slowly, that your brother's grief was not weakness. I think it was the truest thing he ever felt. And I think you could not bear to look at it because it reminded you that you were capable of the same depth of feeling, and that terrified you. Haldric opened his eyes. They were wet. I think you burned the scent eaters because you could not burn the part of yourself that loved your brother and failed him. You needed someone to blame. And my mother was convenient. The word hung in the air, the same word she had used with Draven in the conservatory, aimed now like an arrow at a different target. I gave your mother a quick death, Haldrick said quietly. His voice was barely audible. She begged for mercy. I granted her the blade instead of the pyre. That was all the kindness I could spare. Westland's breath hitched. Tears burned behind her eyes. She blinked them back. You think that makes it right? No, Haldrick said, but it was all I could do, and still sleep at night. The room waited. Draven stood behind Westland, close enough to intervene, but making no move to do so. This was her moment. Her choice. He understood that in a way that went beyond the bond, beyond wolf instinct, beyond king and subject. This was between a daughter and the man who had taken her mother, and no one else had the right to decide how it ended. Westland looked at Lord Haldrick. She looked at his trembling hand and his wet eyes and the weight of 20 years of guilt pressing down on shoulders that were no longer broad enough to carry it. She could destroy him. She had the power now. The king stood behind her, healed and whole, and a single word from her would end Haldrick's life. Not just his position, his titles, his legacy, his life. She could ask for his head, and Draven would grant it without hesitation. The thought moved through her like a dark tide. Tempting, righteous, deserved. She thought of her mother's face in the flames, the calm in her amber eyes, the words mouthed through the smoke. Hide, be strong, survive. But there had been another lesson, one whispered in the dark years before the execution, when Westland was very small, and her mother was teaching her to grind herbs by candlelight. Westland had asked why they helped people who were cruel to them, why they healed the ones who called them defective and broken and wrong. And Marin had smiled and said, because the moment we become what they fear, we prove them right. Our power is not in our fists, little one. It is in our choices. Westland unclenched her hands. The blood trial is cancelled, she said. The proof is complete. The bond is real. The poison is gone. She looked at Haldrick, and her eyes were not soft. They were not forgiving. They were clear. You will not be executed, Lord Haldrick. You will not be exiled. You will do something far more difficult. You will live. You will witness what you tried to destroy. And you will write the true history of the Scent Eaters. Every name you erased, every life you ended, every lie you told to justify the purge. You will write it all, so that no one who comes after you ever makes the same mistake. Haldrick stood frozen. The sentence was not mercy in the way he had expected mercy. It was harder than death. It was accountability without the escape of the grave. It was being forced to look at the full scope of what he had done, and then live inside that knowledge for however many years he had left. As you command, he said, and he bowed his head. Not the political bow of a counselor, a deeper bow, the bow of a man who had been offered something he did not deserve and knew it. Draven's gaze shifted to Matron Griselda, and all warmth vanished from his eyes. You, however, showed no grief, only cruelty. You are stripped of your rank and exiled from Ashenvale. You will leave tonight and never return. Griselda's face went white. She opened her mouth to protest, but 2 guards seized her by the arms and dragged her from the room. Her shrieks echoed down the corridor and faded into the stone silence of the palace. When the doors closed, Draven turned to Westland. His expression transformed in the space of a heartbeat, the king falling away to reveal the man beneath. Are you all right? Westland nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. I confronted the man who killed my mother, and I did not break. No, Draven said, pulling her into his arms. You did not break. You became a queen. The next day was a flurry of preparation. Westland was moved to the Queen's chambers, rooms that had stood empty for 2 generations. Seamstresses measured her for a coronation gown. Courtiers taught her the protocols of court. Servants who had once looked through her as if she were made of glass now addressed her with careful deference that she found more uncomfortable than invisibility. Through it all, Draven stayed close, never more than a room away. Sometimes she would look up from a fitting or a lesson and find him standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression that made her chest ache, as if he still could not quite believe she was real. But there was one person Westland had not seen since the confrontation, Lady Rowena. The High Alpha from the Northern Wastes had been conspicuously absent from all proceedings. The woman who had been brought to Ashen Vale to be Draven's queen, whose political alliance had been the cornerstone of the council's plans, had simply vanished from court. Until the evening before the coronation, when she requested a private audience in the royal gardens. Westland found her standing by a frozen fountain, her crimson cloak stark against the snow. The garden was silent, the only sound the faint crunch of Westland's footsteps on the ice-crusted path. Rowena turned at her approach, and Westland braced for anger, for jealousy, for the cold fury of a woman whose future had been stolen. Instead, she saw only resignation, and something that might have been respect. "So," Rowena said, her voice quiet, "the null who was not a null, the scent eater of legend." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "I suppose I should hate you. You took the match that was meant to be mine." "I did not take anything," Westland said. "The bond chose us. Neither of us had control." Rowena nodded slowly. "I know. I have seen true mate bonds before, rare as they are." She stepped closer, studying Westland's face with the frank, appraising gaze of an alpha accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "You love him. Truly." "I do." "Then you have my blessing, for what it is worth." Rowena pulled a small velvet pouch from her cloak. "This is moonstone from the Northern Wastes. Tradition says it brings clarity to new queens. I had hoped to wear it myself, but..." She pressed it into Westland's hand. "It belongs to you now." Westland's throat tightened. "Thank you, my lady." "Just Rowena." She turned to go, then paused. The smile faded, replaced by something sharper, more urgent. "Westland, I need to tell you something." Rowena glanced over her shoulder, checking that they were alone. "Since I arrived in Ashen Vale, I have been watching, listening. I am an alpha from the Northern Wastes, and where I come from, we learn to read political currents the way sailors read the wind. Something is wrong here, wrong beyond Haldrick and his council." Westland's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "After the trial, I followed Haldrick, not because I suspected him, but because I was curious. He went to the Eastern Chapel, the one that has been closed since the Purge, and he met with 3 men in black cloaks. I could not hear their words, but I could smell their intent. They reeked of void iron and old hatred. Westland's blood went cold. Purge loyalists. That is what I believe. And I believe they are planning something for the coronation tomorrow. Haldrick may have bent the knee, but there are others who have not. Others who still believe scent eaters are abominations, regardless of what the king declares." Rowena's eyes were hard. "Take care tomorrow, Westland. Not everyone who kneels does so with honest knees." She held Westland's gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, her crimson cloak disappearing into the falling snow. Westland stood alone in the frozen garden, the moonstone warm in her palm, the warning cold in her chest. That night, the last night before everything changed, Westlin and Draven were alone in the king's chambers. The fire burned low. The curtains were drawn against the winter dark. Tomorrow would bring the coronation, the crowd, the public declaration that would change the shape of the kingdom. Tonight, there was only this, the two of them, and the quiet. Draven sat on the edge of the bed, watching her move through the room. She was restless, straightening things that did not need straightening, adjusting curtains that hung perfectly well. "You are nervous," he said. "I am terrified," she corrected. She stopped by the window and pressed her forehead against the glass. "Rowena told me there are Purge loyalists. They are planning something tomorrow." "I know." She turned. "You know?" "I have known since Haldrick's meeting. My wolves reported it within the hour." He stood and crossed to her, taking her hands. "I have tripled the guard, the bell tower, the ramparts. Every vantage point will be covered. You will be safe. It is not me I am worried about." He smiled. It was the sad, beautiful smile she had first seen in the throne room, the one that said he had already accepted whatever came and found peace in it. "I have survived a poisoned blade, a decade of madness, and a council of vultures. A few fanatics with crossbows will not be what ends me. Do not joke about this." "I am not joking." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. "I am telling you that whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. That is what the bond means. That is what I mean." Westlin leaned into him. His heartbeat was steady against her cheek, strong, healthy, a sound she would never tire of hearing. "I want to remember tonight," she said softly, "before the crown, before the title, before the kingdom decides what I am. I want one night where I am just Westlin and you are just Draven, and there is nothing between us but this." He tilted her chin up. His eyes searched hers. "May I?" he whispered. "Yes," she said. And this time it was she who closed the distance. The kiss was different from the one during the synthesis. That had been fire and desperation, and the clash of two forces meeting for the first time. This was slow. This was deliberate. This was her hands in his hair and his hands at her waist, and a tenderness so acute it bordered on pain. She kissed him the way you touch something precious that you are afraid will be taken from you by morning. He kissed her back the way a man breathes after nearly drowning, with gratitude and hunger and the unshakable knowledge that the air in his lungs was a gift he would never again take for granted. She took the lead. For the first time, she was the one who stepped forward, who pulled him closer, who explored. Her fingers traced the crescent moon brand on his chest, and he shivered beneath her touch. She felt his restraint, the coiled tension in his muscles, the effort it took him to let her set the pace. "You do not have to hold back," she murmured against his mouth. "I will always hold back until you tell me not to," he replied. "That is not weakness, Westlin. That is the point." She understood then, fully and completely, what he was offering her. Not just desire, not just the bond, choice. In a world that had never given her any, he was handing her every single one. They fell into each other slowly, deliberately, with a care that turned every touch into a conversation and every silence into a confession. It was not the frantic claiming of the synthesis. It was something deeper, quieter, an exploration of each other that had nothing to do with heat or biology and everything to do with two people who had been alone for far too long and were learning, breath by breath, how to be alone together. Afterward, they lay in the dark, limbs tangled, hearts beating in the same slow rhythm. Draven traced idle circles on her shoulder with his fingertip. "Tomorrow I will set a crown upon your head," he said, "and I will kneel before you, not because you are a queen, but because you are you." Weslin pressed her lips to the crescent moon on his chest. "And I will stand beside you, not because you are a king, but because you are you." He pulled her closer. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the kingdom would see her. Tomorrow, the loyalists would make their move. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, for a few more hours, the world was just this room, this warmth, this heartbeat, and it was enough. Dawn came too soon. Weslin stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the Queen's dressing chambers, and for the first time in her life did not recognize the woman staring back at her. She was no longer wearing the soot-stained rags of a servant. She was draped in a gown of midnight blue silk that shimmered with embroidered silver threads echoing the stars above Ashenvale. The fabric hugged her body and flowed behind her like liquid night, pooling on the stone floor in a train that whispered when she moved. Her dark hair had been washed and braided with white moon lilies, their petals still carrying the faint sweetness of the conservatory where Draven had first shown her his scars, and around her throat, resting against the hollow where her pulse beat fast and visible, the moonstone Rowena had given her gleamed with a soft inner light. For the first time in 23 years, she was not wearing suppressants. Her scent flowed freely from her skin, a rich, calm melody of blooming jasmine and ancient honey that filled the dressing room like an invisible tide. The maids who moved around her, adjusting hems and smoothing fabric, did so with quiet reverence. These were the same women who had ignored her for years, who had looked through her as if she were made of air. Now their hands trembled slightly when they touched her gown, not from fear, but from the biological response to a scent eater in full bloom. Her presence soothed them, calmed the jagged edges of their nerves, made the room feel safe in a way none of them could articulate, but all of them could feel. Weslin watched them in the mirror and thought of her mother. Marin would have understood this, the way a room changes when you stop hiding, the way people soften when you let them feel what you truly are. The door opened. Draven entered dressed in his full royal regalia, black leather and silver armor, polished to a mirror shine. A cloak of wolf fur draped over his shoulders, thick and dark, the pelts of wolves who had served the Thornwall line for generations. And on his head, the crown of Ashenvale, a circlet of black steel and obsidian that caught the morning light and threw it back in sharp, fractured angles. He looked like a king from the old stories, the ones her mother used to whisper in the dark, the ones where the world was brutal and beautiful and the heroes earned their endings in blood. But when his eyes found hers in the mirror, the king disappeared. And there was only the man who had pressed his forehead to hers and chosen to wait. The man who had told her his darkest memory in the quiet after the synthesis. The man who had whispered, "May I?" before every touch and meant it every single time. He stopped dead in the center of the room. "You look like the dawn," he said. Weslin turned to face him, taking his hands in hers. His fingers were warm and steady. The crescent moon brand pulsed faintly beneath his shirt, answering the one over her own heart. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Once we step out there, there is no going back to the shadows." She held his gaze. "I spent 20 years in the shadows, Draven. I am ready for the light." He smiled. and it was the kind of smile that could break hearts and mend them all at once. Then let us show them their queen. The balcony was a stage of stone and sky. It jutted from the palace's western face like a jaw thrust forward in defiance, overlooking the great square of Ashenvale where thousands of shifters had gathered in the cold. Their breath rose in clouds that merged with the low winter fog, and the torches they carried turned the square into a sea of flickering amber light. The murmur of their voices reached the balcony as a low, constant hum, the sound of a kingdom holding its breath. Westlin and Draven stepped through the arched doorway and into the open air. The roar was immediate, thousands of voices rising at once in a cacophony of cheers, questions, and uncertainty. Some called the king's name. Some shouted questions about the null maid. Some simply stared, their faces tilted upward like flowers turning toward a sun they were not sure they trusted. The cold hit Westlin's bare shoulders, but she did not flinch. The warmth of Draven's hand at the small of her back was enough. He stepped to the edge of the balcony and raised his hand. The noise died like a flame robbed of air. First the front rows, then the middle, then the far edges of the square. Silence rolled through the crowd like a wave until the only sounds were the snap of torch flames and the distant howl of wind across the palace ramparts. "People of Ashenvale," Draven began, and his voice carried across the square with the effortless authority of a man who had been born to fill spaces with his presence. "For 10 years you have feared the madness of the crown. You have seen your king become a beast, locked away during blood moons, a prisoner to the poison in his veins. You have whispered in your homes and wondered how long before the wolf consumed the man entirely." He paused. The silence was so complete that Westlin could hear the heartbeat of the guard standing 6 feet behind her. But tonight the moon brings no madness, only clarity. He turned to Westlin, extended his hand. She took it, and he pulled her forward, gently but deliberately, until she stood beside him at the balcony's edge. The torchlight caught the silver threads in her gown and the moonstone at her throat, and for a moment she shimmered against the dark stone like a star that had fallen to earth and refused to go out. "I present to you your queen," Draven declared, "Westlin Ashgrove, the woman who took the poison into her own soul so that our kingdom might breathe again." A cheer began to erupt from the crowd, raw and uneven, the sound of a people who wanted to believe but were not yet certain they were allowed to. And then Westlin's instincts screamed. It was not a thought, not a decision. It was her scent-eater nature flaring to life with a violence that made her gasp. The air around her shifted. The ambient scents of the square, torch smoke, sweat, wool, the earthy musk of thousands of wolves in human skin, all of it receded, pushed aside by something sharper, colder, wrong, steel, the bitter metallic tang of freshly forged steel, and beneath it, something worse, an oily, acrid stench that coated the back of her throat and made her stomach clench. She had smelled it once before, on the ribbon the wolf pup had carried to her tower. The scent of void iron. Her eyes moved before her mind could catch up, scanning the rooftops, the towers, the shadowed alcoves that lined the square. Her gaze swept left, swept right, and then snapped upward to the bell tower that rose from the eastern edge of the square, like a stone finger pointing at the sky. A glint of moonlight on metal. A crossbow. Aimed at the balcony. Aimed at Draven's throat. "Draven, down!" She did not wait for him to react. She did not think. She threw herself in front of him, her body between his chest and the bell tower, Her arms spread wide as if she could shield a 6'4" alpha king with nothing but bone and silk and stubbornness. The bolt released. She heard it before she saw it. A sharp hiss cutting through the silence, the sound a viper makes before it strikes. The void iron tip caught the torchlight as it arced across the square, a black streak against the amber glow, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. Westland could see the fletching, the spiral grooves cut into the shaft, the faint purple shimmer of the void iron point designed to pierce shifter hide and prevent regeneration. It was going to hit her. She braced for the impact, braced for the cold bite of metal through flesh. But as the bolt entered the space around her, the golden mist that surrounded her body thickened, not by her conscious will, by something deeper. The Scent Eater's shield, the protective power that had awakened during the bonding, responded to the threat with an instinct older than thought. The golden haze condensed into something almost solid, a shimmering barrier of pure Omega energy that hummed with a frequency she could feel in her teeth. The bolt struck the barrier and shattered. 1,000 fragments of void iron and wood exploded outward, raining down on the balcony like glittering snow. Westland felt the impact as a pressure against her palms, a vibration that traveled up her arms and into her chest, but no pain, no wound. The shield held. The crowd gasped, a collective breath drawn by thousands of lungs at the same instant. Draven's face transformed behind her. She did not see it, but she felt it through the bond. Shock first, sharp and white, then fury. Not the blind, poisoned rage that the shadow had fed for a decade. This was clean, focused, the controlled wrath of an alpha whose mate had just been targeted. "Guards!" Draven roared, and his voice shook the foundations of the balcony. "Bring me the coward who dares." Within seconds, royal guards swarmed the bell tower. The assassin tried to flee, scrambling down the stone steps, but he was cornered within moments, dragged from the tower and thrown into the square below. He landed hard on the cobblestones, and the crowd surged back from him like water from a burning coal. But Westland's shield had not dropped, because the air was not yet clean. She felt it a half-second before it happened. A second bolt. From a different direction, not the bell tower, the rampart wall to the south. A second archer. One that the guards had not found because no one had been looking for two. "Draven!" She spun, reaching for him, but she was too late. The bolt caught him in the left shoulder. The impact drove him back a step. He looked down at the shaft protruding from his body, the void iron tip buried deep in the muscle. And for a moment, his expression was almost confused, as if his body had forgotten what it felt like to be wounded now that the constant agony of the poison was gone. Then the pain hit. He dropped to one knee. Westland screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and primal, and the golden mist around her pulsed in response, flaring bright enough to cast shadows across the entire square. Guards surged toward the southern rampart. Shouts echoed off the stone. The second archer was found within minutes, dragged down from his perch and thrown beside the first in the square below. But Westland was not watching the guards. She was on her knees beside Draven, her hands on his face, his shoulder, the shaft of the bolt she did not dare pull free. "Stay with me," she said. "Draven, stay with me." "I am fine," he said through gritted teeth. Blood was spreading across his shirt, dark and fast. "It is just a shoulder. It is void iron. It will prevent healing." "Then it is a good thing I have a scent eater." From below, a voice rose above the chaos. The null has no right to wear a crown. Wesleyan looked down. A man had stepped forward from the crowd. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in the dark robes of a minor lord, and his face was twisted with a conviction that went beyond anger into something close to religious fervor. Other figures emerged from the crowd behind him. 5, 10, 15. Men and women who had been hiding among the citizens, waiting for the signal. Purge loyalists. The leader raised his voice, projecting it across the square with practiced authority. The scent eaters were purged for a reason. They are parasites, abominations. They weaken our alphas and corrupt our bloodlines. What you have witnessed tonight is not healing. It is enslavement. The king is not cured. He is controlled. A murmur ran through the crowd. Doubt. Wesleyan could smell it. The sharp, sour scent of uncertainty spreading through the square like smoke. She looked at Draven. He was trying to stand, his jaw clenched against the pain, his hand pressed over the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers. "Stay down," she said. "Wesleyan, I said stay down." She stood. Her knees were trembling. Her hands were shaking. But her voice was not. She turned to the edge of the balcony and looked down at the loyalist leader, at the 15 figures arrayed behind him, at the thousands of uncertain faces beyond. She thought of the glass vial shattering on the hearth, the green liquid evaporating, the moment her true self had been exposed to the world after 15 years of hiding. She had spent her entire life terrified of this. Of being seen, of being known, of standing before a crowd and having them look at her and judge what they found. But she was not the girl behind the barrels anymore. She was not the child watching through smoke. Wesleyan closed her eyes and reached for the power inside her. Not the shield. Something else. Something the scroll had described, but she had not yet tested. The projection. The ability to extend her scent outward, not as a barrier, but as a wave, not to block, but to reveal. She exhaled. The golden mist around her expanded. It rolled off the balcony like fog, drifting down into the square, touching every face, every pair of lungs, every wolf hiding beneath human skin. It was not aggressive. It was not forceful. It was an offering. A truth made tangible. And every shifter in the square felt it. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of something deeper. A bone-level certainty that the woman on the balcony was not a parasite, not a manipulator, not an abomination. She was the missing piece they had never known they needed. The balance their biology had been crying out for across generations of unchecked aggression and unexplained rage. The loyalist leader fell to his knees, not because of force, because his wolf, the animal inside him that operated on instinct rather than ideology, collapsed in recognition. In shame, the wolf knew what the man had been too proud and too afraid to see. The other loyalists followed. One by one, like dominoes, they sank to the cobblestones. Wesleyan looked down at them. Her voice carried across the square, clear and steady and filled with a quiet authority that owed nothing to crowns or titles or bloodlines. You tried to kill a king to preserve your lies, but you cannot kill the truth. The era of the Shadow Wars is over. The era of the Purge is over. This is the age of balance. She turned back to Draven. He was on his feet, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes blazing with something that burned brighter than pain. Pride, love, a fierce, incredulous joy that the woman he had found broken in his chambers 2 nights ago was now standing before an entire kingdom and bending it toward justice with nothing but her voice and her scent and the unshakable core of who she was. She knelt beside him, placed her hand over the wound on his shoulder. The void iron bolt was still embedded in the muscle, but she could feel her power responding to the wrongness of the metal, heating it, loosening its grip on his flesh. She wrapped her fingers around the shaft. "This is going to hurt," she said. "Everything hurts," he replied. The same words he had spoken in his study, but the smile he gave her now was different from the broken grimace of that night. This smile was alive. She pulled. The bolt came free with a wet, ugly sound. Draven's jaw clenched, a low growl vibrating in his chest, but he did not cry out. Westland pressed her palm flat against the wound and let the golden light pour into him. She felt the void iron's residue, a cold, dark film coating the torn muscle, resisting regeneration. Her power wrapped around it, heated it, burned it away cell by cell until nothing remained but clean flesh and the natural healing of an alpha in his prime. The wound closed beneath her hand. Not instantly, not cleanly, but it closed. Within minutes, the bleeding had stopped and the color was returning to his face. Draven caught her wrist as she pulled her hand away. He held it against his chest, over the crescent moon brand, and looked into her eyes. "Do not ever step in front of a crossbow bolt for me again," he said. "Do not ever tell me what to do," she replied. He laughed, a real laugh, full and warm and slightly unhinged with the adrenaline and the pain and the absurdity of laughing while bleeding on a balcony in front of the entire kingdom. Then he reached behind him, where a council elder stood holding a velvet cushion, and picked up the lunar crown. It was beautiful, a delicate circlet of silver and moonstone, ancient and elegant, crafted in a time when queens were not ornaments but pillars. The stones caught the torchlight and fractured it into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced across Westland's face. Draven held it in both hands, and then, still bleeding, still pale, still bearing the evidence of the night's violence on his body, the Alpha King of Ashen Vale lowered himself to one knee before the woman who had been a servant in his household 3 days ago. "By the old laws and the new," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the square, "I name you Luna, Queen of Ashen Vale, protector of the weak, guardian of peace, my mate, my equal, my heart." He placed the crown upon her head. The silver was cool against her forehead. The moonstones hummed with a faint vibration she could feel in her teeth. And the weight of it, light as it was, settled over her like the closing of a circle that had been open her entire life. Below, the pack knelt, not in groups, not in waves, all at once. Thousands of shifters dropping to the cobblestones in a single synchronized motion that produced a sound like distant thunder. The loyalists, still on their knees, bowed their heads deeper. The guards on the ramparts knelt. The servants watching from the palace windows knelt. Even Lady Rowena, standing at the edge of the crowd in her crimson cloak, inclined her head with a small, private smile. Draven rose to his feet and stood beside Westland. Not behind her, not in front, beside. She looked out at the sea of kneeling figures, the torchlight reflected in 1,000 upturned eyes, and for the first time in her life, the girl who had been invisible felt entirely, beautifully, irrevocably whole. The crescent moon brands on their chests pulsed in unison beneath their clothes. One rhythm, one heartbeat, one purpose. The age of balance had begun. The morning after the coronation was quiet in the way that only follows a storm. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of the great hall, painting the marble floor in fractured color. Red and gold and deep violet, the hues shifting as clouds drifted across the winter sky outside. The massive oak table had been cleared of the previous night's feast, and in its place sat a simple arrangement. 2 chairs, side by side, equal in height and bearing. Westland sat in the left chair, Draven in the right. Their hands rested on the table between them, fingers loosely intertwined, the gesture so natural that neither of them seemed aware they were doing it. The crescent moon brands on their chests pulsed with a faint warmth that had become as familiar as breathing, a second heartbeat that belonged to both of them and neither of them and the space in between. Before them, flanked by 4 guards, stood the captured assassin and his 3 co-conspirators. They were shackled at wrists and ankles, their faces hollow with the particular exhaustion of men who had gambled everything and lost. The leader, the gaunt man who had proclaimed the loyalist creed in the square, stood at the front. His eyes were fixed on the floor. His wolf, Westland could sense, was still cowering inside him, still flattened by the wave of truth she had projected the night before. Draven spoke first. His voice was calm, measured, carrying none of the fury that had shaken the balcony the night before. This was not a king in the grip of rage. This was a king dispensing justice with the cold precision of a man who had learned the difference between vengeance and accountability. You are hereby sentenced to death for attempted regicide. Your names will be struck from all records. Your bloodlines will bear the shame of your cowardice for 3 generations. The assassins were led away. Their footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing fainter, then disappearing entirely. The doors closed. The hall was empty except for the 2 of them and the colored light. Draven turned to Westland. The formality dropped from his face like a mask removed. "Is it enough?" he asked. "The justice, the coronation, does it make up for the years of silence?" Westland looked at him. She thought about the question the way she thought about everything now, not just with her mind, but with the bond that connected her to him, that let her feel the genuine uncertainty beneath his words. He was not asking whether the kingdom's verdict was sufficient. He was asking whether she was whole, whether the girl who had been invisible for 2 decades could look at the woman wearing the crown and recognize herself. She stood and wrapped her arms around him. He stiffened for a moment, surprised, then melted into her embrace with a completeness that still startled her. This man, who had held back an ocean of pain with nothing but willpower for 10 years, became soft in her arms, pliant, human. "It was not the kingdom's approval I needed," she said against his shoulder. "It was the chance to be seen. You did that before the crown ever touched my head. You did it the first night, when you looked at me and said, 'What are you?' instead of 'Get out.' You saw me, Draven, before anyone else, before I saw myself." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. His arms tightened around her. For a long moment they stood like that, 2 people holding each other in a hall built for hundreds, and the emptiness of the room did not feel lonely. It felt chosen. "What do you want to do now?" he asked quietly. "You are a queen. You can reshape this kingdom." Westland pulled back. Her eyes were bright with something that was not tears, but lived in the same neighborhood. Purpose. The kind that does not announce itself with trumpets, but with quiet, relentless action. "I want to find the others," she said. "The scent eaters who are still hiding. The ones who grew up believing they were broken, the way I did. The ones who are still drinking bitter chamomile and crushing lavender into paste and praying every morning that today is not the day someone discovers what they really are. Her voice gained strength with every word. I want to build them a sanctuary, a place where they can learn what they are, where they do not have to hide. Then we build it together, Draven said, and the simplicity of it, the lack of hesitation, the way he said, we as if there had never been any other option, made her love him so fiercely that her chest ached with it. In the days that followed, Westland learned that becoming a queen was less about ceremony and more about architecture. Not the architecture of buildings, though there was that too. The architecture of change. The careful, deliberate process of dismantling a system that had been built to suppress and replacing it with one designed to protect. It was slower work than she had imagined, more frustrating, more tedious. There were forms to sign and councils to attend and endless meetings with ministers who used 50 words where 5 would do, and who regarded her with expressions that ranged from cautious respect to barely concealed resentment. But she did it, day by day, meeting by meeting, decision by decision. The first decree she issued as Luna Queen abolished the null classification. From that day forward, no shifter in Ashenvale would be designated as scentless, rankless, or defective. The word null was struck from every official document, every census record, every school curriculum. In its place, a new designation, unmanifested, a word that implied potential rather than absence, a word that said not yet instead of never. The second decree established the Scent Eater Registry, a voluntary and confidential record that allowed those who had been hiding to come forward without fear of prosecution. The registry was housed in the Queen's personal office, accessible only to Westland herself, so that no council member, no lord, no authority of any kind could use the information to target those who registered. The third decree was the one that changed everything. Lord Haldrick delivered it himself. He appeared before the court on a morning 3 weeks after the coronation, carrying a leather-bound volume so thick it required both hands to hold. His face was drawn. He had aged visibly in the weeks since Westland had spared his life, the lines around his eyes deeper, the silver in his hair more pronounced. But his back was straight and his voice was steady. This is the first volume of the true history of the Scent Eaters, he said, placing the book on the table before Westland and Draven. It contains the names of every Scent Eater executed during the Purge, their ages, their families, the locations of their graves, where graves exist, and my personal testimony regarding the orders I gave and the reasons I gave them. He paused. His eyes met Westland's. It is not enough, he said. It will never be enough. But it is a beginning. Westland opened the book. The first page was handwritten in Haldrick's precise, angular script. At the top, in ink that was slightly smudged as if the hand that wrote it had been shaking, was a single line. For Marin Ashgrove, who deserved better than I gave her. Westland closed the book. She did not trust herself to speak. She nodded once, and Haldrick bowed, not the shallow, political bow of a counselor, but a deep and genuine bow, and withdrew. That evening she sat alone in the Queen's study and cried, not from grief, though grief was there, not from anger, though anger still lived in the corners. She cried because healing was not a straight line, because justice was not a destination, but a direction, because the man who had killed her mother had written her name with a trembling hand and called it a beginning, and the part of Westland that was still 8 years old and hiding behind barrels did not know whether to scream or forgive or both. Draven found her there an hour later, curled in the armchair with the book in her lap and her eyes red and swollen. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not try to fix it. He sat on the floor beside the chair, leaned his head against her knee, and held her hand while she finished crying. When she was done, he looked up at her and said, "She would be proud of you." And she believed him. Not because the bond told her he was telling the truth, though it did, but because the woman who had taught her to grind herbs by candlelight and whispered recipes in the dark had raised a daughter who chose mercy when vengeance was easier, and that, Weslin understood now, was the bravest thing a person could do. 4 months later, spring transformed Ashen Vale from ice to bloom. The snow retreated from the lower valleys first, then the hillsides, then the high meadows, until the entire kingdom was awash in the pale green of new growth. Wild flowers pushed through the thawing earth in reckless profusion, blanketing the fields in white and yellow and the deep, vivid purple of mountain thistle. The river that ran through the capital, frozen solid since before the blood moon, cracked and surged back to life with a roar that could be heard from the palace walls. And in the royal gardens, where Rowena had once warned her of loyalists in the snow, construction of the Scent Eater Academy was nearly complete. It was a beautiful structure. Glass and stone and living wood, designed by architects who had been given a single instruction from their queen. Make it feel like a place where someone who has been hiding can finally breathe. The main hall was a soaring atrium of crystalline panels that captured sunlight the way the conservatory did, but larger, grander, with walls lined not with weapons, but with books. Thousands of them. Texts on biology, healing, scent theory, pack history, and the old ways that Marin Ashgrove had whispered to her daughter in the dark. There were dormitories with wide windows that faced the sunrise, a greenhouse filled with moon lilies and silverbark saplings, training rooms where newly discovered scent eaters could learn to control their abilities without fear. And at the center of it all, carved into the stone above the main entrance, a single line: "You are not broken. You were hidden." Weslin stood in the great hall one morning, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach, 4 months pregnant, barely showing, just the faintest swell beneath her gown that the healer said was perfectly healthy, perfectly strong. She could feel the child sometimes, not movement yet, but presence, a warmth inside the warmth. A third heartbeat joining the two that already beat in rhythm. She was reading through a stack of correspondence when a messenger arrived, breathless from running, carrying a letter sealed with unfamiliar wax. "From the Eastern Territories, Your Majesty." Weslin broke the seal and read. The letter was written in a child's handwriting, the letters uneven, the ink blotted in places where small fingers had pressed too hard on the pen. Some of the words were misspelled. All of them were urgent. Draven appeared at her side, drawn by the shift in her emotions through the bond. "What is it?" Weslin looked up at him. Tears were filling her eyes, but she was smiling. "A young girl," she said, 12 years old. She thought she was broken, a null. She has spent her whole life believing there was something wrong with her because she had no scent. Her village treated her the way Ashen Vale treated me. Invisible, disposable. She held up the letter. Last month, her father went feral during a hunt. Lost control completely. The pack was ready to put him down, and this girl, this 12-year-old girl who thought she was nothing, she ran to him and grabbed his hand. And she saw golden light. Draven's eyes widened. "Just like me," Weslin whispered. She calmed him. She pulled him back. and she did not understand what had happened or how. She thought she was cursed. She thought she had done something wrong. Westland's voice broke. She was afraid, Draven. The way I was afraid. She looked back at the letter. She says she knows of 3 others, all hiding, all terrified. She found them through whispers, the way my mother found other scent eaters before the purge. Underground, or secret. Children and young women who think they are defective and are living in silence because they have never been told the truth about what they are. Draven placed his hand over hers on her stomach. The crescent moon brands pulsed beneath their clothes, synchronized as they always were now. Then we bring them here, he said, to safety, to the academy, to home. Westland nodded. The tears fell freely now, but they were not the tears of the girl who had cried in the Queen's study over a book of names. They were the tears of a woman who had planted a seed and was watching, for the first time, the green shoots break through the soil. "We are not extinct," she said. Her voice was thick with emotion but steady underneath. The voice of a queen who had earned her crown not through blood or birth, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to disappear. "We were just waiting for someone brave enough to stop hiding first." She looked out the window. The academy rose against the spring sky, its glass walls catching the sunlight and throwing it back in rainbows that danced across the garden paths. Below, in the construction yard, she could see them working. Former nulls and high alphas side by side, carrying stones, raising beams, building something together that neither could have built alone. A gamma woman with sawdust in her hair was laughing at something a beta carpenter had said. An alpha guard was holding a beam steady, while a young girl who had registered as a scent eater just last week directed the placement with the confident authority of someone who had finally discovered her purpose. This was what change looked like. Not a single dramatic moment on a balcony, not a crown placed on a head, but this, the slow, daily, unglamorous work of building a world where the next girl born without a scent would not spend 23 years believing she was nothing. That evening, after the letters were answered and the plans were made, and the Academy's first class of students was officially enrolled, Westland and Draven sat together in their chambers. The fire crackled softly. Spring rain tapped against the windows with a rhythm that sounded like applause. Draven pulled her close, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. His hands found their way to her stomach, palms flat, feeling for the warmth that lived there. "Our child will grow up in a world that celebrates difference," he said softly. Westland placed her hands over his. She could feel the crescent moons on their chests glowing faintly through their clothes, pulsing in the same slow rhythm as the rain. "You know," she said, "the night they sent me to your chambers, I thought I was going to die. I know. And when the vial broke and you pinned me against the door and inhaled like you were trying to breathe me into existence, I thought my life was over." "I know," he said again. She could hear the smile in his voice. "I was wrong." She turned in his arms to face him. His amber eyes were warm in the firelight, the gold flecks catching the flame like scattered stars. "My life was not over. It had not even started yet." He kissed her forehead, her nose, the corner of her mouth, then her lips, soft and slow, with a tenderness that still surprised her even after 4 months of learning the landscape of his gentleness. This was not the desperate kiss of the synthesis, not the raw, aching kiss of the night before the coronation. This was the kiss of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. "I love you," he said. The words were simple. He had said them before, but each time they landed differently. The way sunlight landing on water creates a different pattern with every passing cloud. Tonight they landed like a promise, like a foundation stone, like the first line of a story that would take a lifetime to tell. "I love you," she replied, "and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure every girl who thinks she is nothing learns that she is everything. The way you taught me." He pulled her closer. She closed her eyes and listened to his heartbeat, strong and steady and free of the poison that had nearly consumed it. She thought of her mother, standing at the stake with calm eyes and silent lips. Hide, be strong, survive. "I did more than survive, Mama," she thought. "I lived." The rain continued. The fire crackled. The crescent moons glowed softly beneath their clothes, two marks beating as one. A rhythm that would continue long after this night ended and the next day began. And the seasons turned and the years accumulated, and the academy filled with voices that had once been silent. Outside the palace walls, in the blooming meadows of Ashenvale, a pack of white wolves ran through the wildflowers. Their coats caught the last light of the setting sun, turning them to silver, and their howls rose into the twilight sky. Not the howls of rage that had haunted the kingdom for a decade, not the howls of war or dominance or territorial claim. These were howls of joy, pure, uncomplicated, full-throated joy, the sound of wolves who had forgotten what peace felt like and were remembering it for the first time. In the academy, a 12-year-old girl from the Eastern Territories sat at a desk by a window, a book open before her, reading about the biology she had always carried but never understood. Tears streaked her face, but she was smiling. Beside her, 3 other children, discovered, rescued, brought home, leaned over the same text, their eyes wide with the particular wonder of people who have just learned that the thing they hated most about themselves is the thing the world needs most. In the royal gardens, a frozen fountain had thawed. Water flowed again through channels that had been dry for 20 years, feeding the roots of new planted moon lilies and silver bark trees. By midsummer, the garden would be unrecognizable. By autumn, it would be magnificent. And in the Queen's study, on a shelf beside a leather-bound volume titled The True History of the Scent Eaters, Volume 1, there sat a small collection of objects that told a story no history book ever would. A velvet pouch containing a moonstone from the northern wastes, a crumbling scroll recovered from a dusty tower, a strip of torn silk, stained with soot, from the dress Weslin had worn through the ventilation shafts on the night she had chosen to stop hiding and start living. And beside them, in a simple wooden frame, a portrait, painted from memory by Weslin herself, in the quiet hours before dawn when the palace was still and her husband was sleeping, and the child inside her was a gentle warmth that kept her company. The portrait showed a woman with dark hair and amber eyes. She was not burning. She was not bound. She was standing in a field of wildflowers, her face tilted toward the sun, and she was smiling. Beneath it, in Westland's careful handwriting, 3 words: "She survived us." The age of the balanced heart had begun, and it would last for generations.